What if everything we think we know about global connections before 1500 is incomplete? Picture an ancient map, not the ones drawn in European courts with Africa lurking at the edges, nameless and undefined. Number. Imagine instead a glowing web of trade routes radiating out of Africa in all directions, across the Sahara, through the Red Sea, into the Indian Ocean, and possibly even across the Atlantic. A world where African sailors caught the monsoon winds, where scholars debated philosophy under Sahelian stars, and where gold and manuscripts moved hand in hand across borders older than borders. This is the map they forgot to teach us. Or perhaps the map they deliberately erased. Before colonial powers redrew the world to place themselves at its center, Africa was already central, not marginal. It was not waiting to be discovered. It was known. It was active. It was powerful. Africa was not isolated. It was deeply embedded in the pre-modern global system. From the temples of Aksum to the coral palaces of Kilwa, from the caravan cities of the Sahara to the forest kingdoms of Congo, Africa was connected economically, intellectually, and spiritually to Asia, the Middle East, and the wider world. This story begins not with conquest, but with curiosity. Because long before Europe rose to global dominance, African merchants were already traveling thousands of miles. But how far did they really go? What goods or even ideas flowed out of African ports into distant empires? What technologies and techniques did Africa give the world before colonization? And perhaps most mysteriously, what forgotten cities and coastal kingdoms once linked continents together, long before Europe's empires arrived with cannons and crosses? This documentary is not a revision, it is a restoration of memory, of dignity, and of historical truth. We're about to uncover a world that existed before the one we inherited. One where Africa was not just involved in global history, it was shaping it. So, trace your finger across the old maps, watch the trade routes light up, and prepare to see Africa not as the edge of the world, but as its beating heart. Because before the world changed, Africa was already connected. The Sahara, to many, it conjures images of isolation. An endless sea of sand separating civilizations, severing North Africa from the rest of the continent. But that is a modern illusion. In truth, the Sahara was never a barrier. It was a bridge. A vast, dynamic corridor that pulsed with human movement, cultural exchange, and long-distance trade. Long before the rise of European empires, it served as one of the ancient world's greatest highways. Not of asphalt and steel, but of camel caravans, oral contracts, and stars that guided merchants across the dunes. Rewind the clock even further, and the Sahara reveals a forgotten chapter, the Green Sahara. Thousands of years ago, the desert was not a desert. Between 10,000 and 4,000 BCE, during what is now called the African Humid Period, the region was alive with lakes, rivers, grasslands, and seasonal monsoons. Evidence of prehistoric settlements, rock art, and cattle herding culture suggests that this Green Sahara connected the North, West, and East Africa in ways we're only beginning to understand. People moved, traded, and thrived, not on the edges of an arid void, but across a lush, habitable heartland. As the climate shifted and the desert gradually expanded, these ancient networks adapted, evolving into the trans-Saharan trade routes that would shape the medieval world. By the first millennium CE, the Sahara had become the arterial system of Africa's internal and external commerce. At its core were the Berber and Tuareg traders, desert navigators who knew every dune, oasis, and wind. With them moved Hausa merchants from the savannas, Kanuri emissaries from Lake Chad, and Soninke entrepreneurs from the Ghana Empire. These weren't isolated figures braving a lifeless expanse. They were agents of a sophisticated trade system, stretching from the Niger River to the Mediterranean. Cities rose along these arteries, each one a node in a vast, buzzing network. In the north, Garama served as a capital of the Garamantes and later a staging post for Saharan routes. In the west, Gao and Tagaza became synonymous with wealth and strategic power. Tagaza in particular was built entirely of salt, a resource so vital it was sometimes traded ounce for ounce with gold. And in the central Sahel, legendary cities like Kumbi Saleh and Adagust flourished as commercial capitals, bustling with trade in gold, ivory, slaves, kola nuts, and manuscripts. Then there was Timbuktu, perhaps the most famous of all. Situated near the Niger River and just south of the desert's edge, Timbuktu was not only a trading hub, but a lighthouse of knowledge. Caravans brought not just commodities, but books. Scholars, scribes, and theologians turned Timbuktu into a center of Islamic learning, housing thousands of manuscripts in astronomy, law, medicine, and philosophy. Its intellectual reputation rivaled that of Baghdad and Cordoba, placing West Africa firmly within the global scholarly community. These routes weren't just for goods. They carried stories, technologies, ideas, and people. Pilgrims made the long journey to Mecca and returned with new worldviews. Architects from the Maghreb traveled south to design mosques. Language itself flowed. Arabic merged with African tongues, producing creoles and scripts that reflected a shared cultural space. And all of this happened centuries before the first European merchant ever touched African shores. The key to understanding the system lies in abandoning the myth of the Sahara as an empty divide. It was instead a connective tissue, one that held together empires, ethnic groups, and economic zones across thousands of miles. It challenged its travelers, yes, but it never truly separated them. So, when we speak of Africa's ancient role in global history, we must include the sands of the Sahara, not as the edge of the world, but as the path that bound worlds together. A golden highway beneath the stars. The Nile has long been seen as a river of pyramids and pharaohs, a waterway flowing northward into the Mediterranean and into the hearts of ancient empires like Greece and Rome. But to focus only on the Nile's northern path is to miss half its story. In reality, the Nile opened eastward as well, into the Red Sea, across to Arabia, and beyond to the wider world of South Asia. Long before colonialism or even Islam, there existed a powerful nexus of trade, culture, and diplomacy between northeastern Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. This was not the fringe of the ancient world. It was one of its most active and integrated crossroads. One of the earliest documented instances of African involvement in long-distance trade comes from the fabled land of Punt. As early as 2500 BCE, Egyptian records describe expeditions to this mysterious kingdom, located somewhere in the Horn of Africa, likely modern-day Eritrea or Somalia. These were not raids but formal trade missions. The Egyptians sought incense, myrrh, gold, ebony, exotic animals, and other precious goods. Ships were built for this purpose, sailing from ports near Thebes down the Nile and out through the Red Sea. Reliefs in Queen Hatshepsut's mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari depict the splendor of these voyages, showing African rulers meeting Egyptian envoys as equals. Punt was not a fantasy. It was a thriving trade partner, and its connections to Egypt helped forge one of the earliest maritime links between Africa and the wider Afro-Arabian world. This eastward current continued through the kingdoms of Nubia and Kush. These civilizations, often overshadowed by their northern neighbors, developed their own Red Sea ports, such as Berenike and Adulis. These were bustling harbors where African goods flowed out and foreign commodities flowed in. Textiles from India, wine from the Levant, incense from Arabia, and even Roman coins have been found in these sites, revealing an intricate web of exchange. Adulis in particular was a major hub under the Aksumite Empire, a Christian African power that rose to prominence between the 1st and 7th centuries CE. Aksum controlled key ports along the Red Sea and became one of the 4 great powers of the ancient world, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. Its rulers minted their own coins, constructed monumental obelisks, and maintained sophisticated diplomatic ties. Through Adulis, Aksumite traders exported ivory, gold, frankincense, and enslaved persons, while importing silk, spices, and luxury goods. Roman and Greek geographers spoke of Aksum with respect. The empire's reach even extended into Arabia itself. Across the Red Sea, in what is now Yemen, African merchants and migrants played key roles in the ancient kingdom of Himyar. This was not just economic, it was cultural. There is evidence of deep intermixing between African and Arabian populations, seen in shared burial practices, architecture, and the gradual blending of religious ideas. At one point, Aksum even launched a military intervention in Himyar to protect local Christian communities, establishing temporary political control over parts of the Arabian Peninsula. This wasn't Africa looking outward with envy. This was Africa asserting itself as a regional power, shaping the politics and trade routes of Southwest Asia. What emerges from this historical arc is a clear pattern. Africa and Arabia were not separated by sea. They were joined by it. The Red Sea was not a border. It was a bridge. Across it flowed merchants, ideas, and alliances that predate Islam by centuries and colonialism by millennia. The Nile then was never a river that ended at the Mediterranean. It was a river that opened outward, not only toward Europe, but toward the east, toward Arabia, India, and beyond. The civilizations that rose along its banks understood this deeply. They sailed its currents, they built ports on its shores, and they participated in a dynamic world system that history has too often overlooked. Africa was not peripheral to global exchange. In the Nile Red Sea Arabia nexus, it was absolutely central, anchoring a zone of commerce and culture that shaped the ancient world in profound, enduring ways. Long before Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and set foot on East African shores, the Swahili Coast was already sailing the Indian Ocean, riding the seasonal monsoon winds with practiced precision. This was no untouched coastline awaiting European discovery. It was the eastern edge of a black African maritime world, a constellation of city-states that thrived for centuries as part of a dynamic Afro-Eurasian trade network. From Kilwa to Mombasa, Zanzibar to Sofala, the Swahili city-states were wealthy, cosmopolitan, and deeply connected to the global currents of commerce, culture, and religion. The Swahili Coast stretches roughly 2,500 kilometers along the Indian Ocean, encompassing parts of modern-day Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique. It was here, along these coral-fringed shores, that African communities developed a sophisticated culture rooted in Bantu traditions, enriched by centuries of interaction with Arab, Persian, and Indian merchants. The Swahili language itself, a Bantu tongue with Arabic, Persian, and Hindi loanwords, is a living record of these ancient entanglements. By the 8th century CE, these coastal cities were already major players in the Indian Ocean economy. Their ships, long wooden dhows with Latin sails, followed the monsoon winds that blew northeast in the summer and reversed southwest in the winter. This natural cycle allowed for predictable round-trip voyages between East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, India, and even as far as China. The people of the Swahili Coast were not simply recipients of foreign influence. They were sailors, traders, shipbuilders, and navigators. They mastered the monsoon, long before European maritime empires began their Indian Ocean expeditions. Among the most powerful of these city-states was Kilwa, located on an island off the coast of present-day Tanzania. In the 13th and 14th centuries, Kilwa controlled the southern reaches of the Swahili trading network, including the gold exporting port of Sofala in present-day Mozambique. This gave Kilwa access to the immense gold reserves of the Zimbabwe Plateau. Gold mined inland, especially from the powerful kingdom of Great Zimbabwe, was transported to the coast via caravan routes and rivers, then loaded onto ships bound for markets across the ocean. Persian and Arab traders prized African gold, which became a critical component of monetary systems in cities like Cairo, Baghdad, and Delhi. But gold was only part of the story. Swahili merchants also exported ivory, rhinoceros horn, tortoiseshell, copal resin, and enslaved individuals. In return, they imported Chinese porcelain, Persian glassware, Indian cottons, silks, spices, and ceramics. Archaeological sites along the Swahili coast have yielded an abundance of these artifacts, revealing a material culture that was anything but provincial. Chinese Celadon bowls, Ming dynasty plates, Persian storage jars, and Indian textile fragments have all been excavated from coastal homes, graves, and mosques. These weren't elite novelties. They were signs of a society integrated into the luxury trade of the medieval world. One of the most vivid testimonies to the Swahili coast's wealth and urban sophistication comes from the famed Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta. In 1331, he visited the city of Kilwa and was astonished by its grandeur. He described it as one of the most beautiful and well-constructed towns in the world, with coral stone buildings, grand mosques, and bustling markets. He praised its cleanliness, its piety, and its prosperity. Ibn Battuta's account offers a rare window into an African civilization that few outside the region had chronicled, and it directly contradicts the myth that African cities were simple or unsophisticated before the European arrival. Each Swahili city was governed by its own ruling elite, often Muslim, who maintained control over trade routes and diplomatic relations. While united by language, religion, and commerce, the city-states remained politically independent, engaging in competition, alliances, and occasional warfare. Their coastal architecture, built from coral limestone, with intricately carved wooden doors and shaded courtyards, mirrored the urban traditions of Arabia and Persia, while remaining uniquely East African. Religion played a central role in this cultural fusion. Islam arrived on the Swahili coast through trade, not conquest. It was embraced gradually, shaping legal systems, education, and social life. Mosques dotted the coast, some built as early as the 9th century. Quranic schools flourished, and Islamic scholars played important roles in diplomacy and governance. Yet Islamic faith blended with local customs. Ancestral reverence, spirit beliefs, and kinship rituals continued, creating a hybrid cultural identity that was proudly African and proudly maritime. This was the Swahili world, rooted in Africa, open to the ocean, and deeply connected to Arabia, Persia, India, and China. It was a civilization built not on isolation, but on movement of people, goods, stories, and beliefs. And all of it took place centuries before Vasco da Gama ever stepped foot on East African soil. The Swahili coast proves that Africa was not watching global history from the sidelines. It was sailing the front lines. This was a thriving, literate international civilization, and its harbors, homes, and history still whispered the rhythms of an ancient world connected by wind, wave, and wheel. When we think of Africa's ancient global ties, the usual lens looks westward, toward the Sahara, the Mediterranean, or even across the Atlantic. But some of Africa's oldest and most enduring connections stretched east, across the Indian Ocean and into the vast cultural and economic worlds of India, Sri Lanka, and even beyond. From the glittering ports of the Swahili coast to the trading posts of southern India, Africa's presence in Asia was not only visible, it was foundational. From gold to giraffes, from sacred beads to skilled warriors, the African-Asian exchange long predates European empire building and reveals a world more connected than history books have dared to admit. The evidence is undeniable. Along India's western coast, archaeologists have uncovered African ivory and gold artifacts dating back to well before the Islamic period. Ports like Baruch and Muziris in ancient India received goods from East African merchants who brought not just luxury items, but also live animals, giraffes, lions, and zebras, gifts that would stun royal courts and become emblems of distant wonder. In return, Indian cottons, spices, and beads made their way to African shores. Sri Lanka, known for its gem trade, also yielded glass beads and ornaments of East African origin. This wasn't a one-sided interaction. It was mutual, sustained, and deeply embedded in both societies. But the exchange wasn't only material, it was human. To this day, South Asia is home to African-descended communities known as the Siddhis. Located mainly in India's Gujarat, Karnataka, and Hyderabad regions, the Siddhis trace their ancestry to African seafarers, traders, and soldiers who arrived on the subcontinent as early as the 7th century, and perhaps even before. Many were brought during the Islamic period as mercenaries or elite guards, and over time they rose to prominent positions in courts and militaries. Siddhi rulers even established their own princely states during the Mughal era. But oral histories and linguistic traces suggest their roots run deeper, potentially reaching into pre-Islamic, pre-colonial Afro-Asian interactions through trade and voluntary migration. There are even tantalizing clues of earlier contacts. Some scholars speculate on possible indirect links between the Kushite civilization of ancient Sudan and the Indus Valley civilization, which flourished in present-day Pakistan and northwest India between 2600 and 1900 BCE. While no direct evidence has yet confirmed sustained contact, the presence of African-type figurines in Harappan contexts, as well as shared motifs in seals and metallurgy, suggest a broader web of interaction that may have included intermediaries from Arabia or the Persian Gulf. It's a reminder that ancient trade rarely followed modern borders. It flowed along rivers, currents, and ideas, connecting worlds now seen as separate. Technological diffusion adds another layer to this story. Both African and Indian civilizations developed advanced metallurgy. Iron smelting techniques in Nok and Meroe found parallels in Indian subcontinental innovations. Agricultural methods, including water storage systems and irrigation channels, also bore striking similarities. And then there's maritime knowledge. The monsoon wind systems that guided Swahili dhows across the Indian Ocean were the same winds that had powered Indian ships to East Africa and back. The science of these journeys was not incidental. It was inherited, refined, and shared over generations of collaboration between seafarers from both sides of the ocean. More than a trading route, this African-Asian corridor was a space of cultural fusion, of language, dress, cuisine, and belief. East African words entered Indian languages. Indian textiles shaped African fashion. Musical rhythms, religious practices, and even architectural influences moved quietly across the sea. It wasn't empire that spread them, it was exchange. And through it, Africa was not a silent supplier of raw materials. It was a contributor to civilization, to aesthetics, to technology, and to the human story that connects continents. Africa and South Asia were not distant strangers awaiting European introduction. They were partners in a world system that was already old, already rich, and already global, centuries before the sails of conquest ever appeared on the horizon. The ancient Mediterranean is often portrayed as a world dominated by European powers. The Greeks, the Romans, the Phoenicians, But this image ignores a fundamental truth. Africa was not just involved in this world, it helped shape it. From Egypt's intellectual influence on Greek philosophers, to Carthage's naval dominance, to Rome's hunger for African gold, the Mediterranean was not a closed European sea. It was a shared space, and Africa was one of its most vital contributors, economically, culturally, and intellectually. Let's begin with Carthage, the great North African maritime empire that stood as a direct rival to Rome. Founded by Phoenician settlers from Tyre around 814 BCE, Carthage quickly grew into a powerful city-state in present-day Tunisia. It was not simply a transplant of Levantine culture. It was a hybrid civilization combining African geography, Phoenician seafaring, and indigenous Berber alliances. Carthage controlled vast parts of North Africa, southern Spain, and the western Mediterranean islands. Its navy was unmatched, and its merchants traded across the known world. Carthaginian engineers built advanced harbors, and the agronomists, like Mago, wrote influential manuals on agriculture that were preserved even by their Roman enemies. The legacy of Carthage is more than Hannibal's elephants crossing the Alps. It's the story of a sophisticated African state that stood toe-to-toe with the greatest European empire of the age. When Rome finally destroyed Carthage in 146 BCE, it was not only a military conquest. It was also a symbolic attempt to erase African influence from Mediterranean history, a pattern that would repeat across centuries. Even before Carthage, Africa had long been embedded in the Mediterranean world through Egypt. From as early as 3000 BCE, Egypt maintained constant exchanges with the Levant, Cyprus, and Mesopotamia. These were not passive contacts. Egyptian art, writing, religious symbols, and building techniques influenced the cultures around it, and in many cases, were imitated or adapted wholesale. The famous obelisks of Egypt would later be copied in Rome. Egyptian papyrus became the standard for written records across the region. Greek historians themselves acknowledge the African roots of their learning. Herodotus, often called the father of history, traveled to Egypt and described the people as having dark skin and woolly hair. He, along with other thinkers like Pythagoras, reportedly studied in Egyptian temples and regarded Kemet, the land of the black people, as a source of philosophical and mathematical knowledge. Plato's ideas of cosmic order echo Egyptian Ma'at. Greek medicine and astronomy owe debts to Nile Valley scholarship. Egypt was not a mystery to the Greeks, it was a teacher. Further west, the Roman Empire depended heavily on Africa, particularly its gold. Though Rome conquered Egypt and parts of North Africa, it never managed to seize the rich gold fields of West Africa. Instead, Rome relied on a vast and intricate trade network that funneled gold from Ghana and the Sahel through desert caravans to North African ports. This gold, exchanged through Berber and Tuareg intermediaries, was essential to minting Roman coins and sustaining imperial economies. African commodities like ivory, ebony, incense, and even exotic animals were highly priced in Roman markets. Lions and leopards shipped from North and Sub-Saharan Africa were used in Roman arenas. African exports weren't luxuries. They were integral to the empire's economy and image of power. But Africa's influence was not only material. African intellectual and religious ideas traveled alongside trade. Egyptian cosmology shaped later Greco-Roman esotericism. African deity, often misnamed or rebranded, appeared in Mediterranean cults. And through Jewish and Christian communities rooted in North Africa and Egypt, Africa played a central role in shaping the spiritual and theological landscape of the ancient Mediterranean. To see Africa as marginal in Mediterranean history is to accept a map made by conquerors. The reality is far richer. Africa was a driver of Mediterranean thought, economy, and empire. not just through its proximity, but through its innovation, its resistance, and its constant engagement. Africa was not just traded with, it traded ideas, it built cities, it birthed movements. It shapes the very world the Mediterranean would later claim as its own. The ocean does not lie. Its currents, winds, and tides are as old as memory, and they whisper of voyages long before Columbus ever set sail. Between West Africa and the New World lies a natural highway, the equatorial Atlantic currents that flow westward. These are not modern routes, they are ancient pathways. Mariners of old knew them. The question is not whether Africa could reach the Americas. The question is whether it already did. The Atlantic currents of West Africa run steadily toward the Caribbean and the Atlantic coast of South America. Even the Portuguese observed that once a ship caught the Guinea current, it would drift west with remarkable speed. For ancient sailors who understood winds, stars, and waves, these currents wouldn't have been obstacles. They would have been avenues. To dismiss African Atlantic contact as impossible is to ignore geography in favor of prejudice. One of the more audacious claims of African Atlantic contact involves the legendary fleets of Mansa Abubakari II of the Mali Empire. Around 1311 CE, sources suggest that Abubakari financed a massive expedition of ships westward into the unknown Atlantic. While European chroniclers often downplay or mock this claim as myth, the logic behind it deserves scrutiny. If a civilization with proven navigational and shipbuilding capability attempted an Atlantic crossing, even as exploration, that is significant. Whether those ships reached land or perished at sea is still debated, but the attempt itself reveals ambition, capacity, and curiosity. Beyond legend, there is hard interdisciplinary evidence that merits serious attention. Botanists have traced the presence of African plants and crops, like certain varieties of cotton and the bottle gourd, in pre-Columbian context in the Americas. The bottle gourd, in particular, has genetic lineages that point to African origin. It is puzzling that it appears in ancient New World sites without a clear migration route post-Columbus. Linguists, too, have observed possible parallel words and phonetic echoes across West African and Caribbean dialects. These similarities are not proof in themselves, but they add weight to a hypothesis that deserves deeper investigation, not dismissal. We must treat this as serious interdisciplinary study, not speculative fiction. Archaeologists, geneticists, and historians are increasingly collaborating to test hypotheses of pre-colonial contact. In some coastal sites in Brazil, for example, stone tools and shell middens show uncanny resemblance to West African technology. Not identical, but suggestive of shared maritime culture. These findings are contested, and scholars debate chronology. Yet, what matters most is the opening of space for inquiry, refusing to dismiss African ingenuity on the threshold of evidence. Some critics argue that even if contact occurred, it was incidental, sporadic, or insignificant compared to European colonization. That may be true, but the key point is this: Africa had the means, the navigational knowledge, the maritime tradition, and the oceanic routes necessary for Atlantic travel. To claim otherwise is to deny Africa agency in the story of global contact. Whether systematic or occasional, Africa crossing the Atlantic is no longer a fringe theory. It is part of a growing conversation about ancient seafaring. If we understand Africa's maritime capacity in the Indian Ocean and Red Sea, then Atlantic ambition should not astonish us. The currents, after all, have been telling their story for millennia. And perhaps, if we listen closely, we will hear the echoes of African voyages long before Europe's conquistadors ever dreamed of the New World. The map we inherited is upside down, not just in orientation, but in meaning. It is a cartography of power, not truth. For centuries, Africa was pushed to the margins of history. Its civilizations flattened, its achievements minimized, its connections severed. But when we turn that map right side up, what we see is not emptiness, but radiance. From the earliest trade routes to the great river kingdoms, from maritime cities to spiritual centers, Africa was never isolated. It was central, a place from which culture, commerce, and knowledge flowed outward. European colonial narratives deliberately recast Africa as a continent without history. It was portrayed as static, primitive, and dark, not because it was true, but because this myth served a purpose. If Africa had no civilization, then in conquest could be called discovery. If it had no philosophy, then domination could be framed as civilization. This was not just erasure, it was inversion. A continent that had long stood as a hub of movements, trade, and spiritual complexity was rewritten as a blank slate, waiting to be written upon by others. But the evidence we've uncovered tells a different story. From Napta Playa's ancient astronomical stones to the bustling Swahili ports that traded with India and China, Africa has always been part of the global system. The Sahara, far from being a barrier, was a golden highway. The Nile flowed not just north, but east into Arabia. African merchants sailed the monsoon winds, and its gold funded Mediterranean empires. Manuscripts in Timbuktu preserved the thoughts of generations, and oral traditions kept law, science, and history alive long before the printing press. This is not a story of reaction, it is a story of origination. Africa was not passively absorbing influence, it was radiating it. Its people were not isolated, they were in a constant motion. Ideas traveled from Africa to Asia, artifacts moved from African coasts into the heart of Eurasia, and cultural echoes crossed oceans. Even the possibility of pre-Columbian Atlantic contact suggests that Africa's reach stretched farther than historians once dared to imagine. To reclaim this truth is not an act of nostalgia, it is an act of restoration. It recenters Africa not merely on maps, but in the philosophical framework of global history. Africa was not a footnote, it was a foundation. It was a civilizational engine, with cities that glittered, systems that endured, and philosophies that governed life in harmony with the cosmos. Civilizations in Africa didn't rise and fall in isolation. They were part of a wider rhythm, in sync with other global centers, and in dialogue with their surroundings. The implications of this are profound. If Africa was central in the ancient world, then the assumptions of the modern world must be re-examined. If Africa led in metallurgy, astronomy, navigation, and urban planning, then what else have we overlooked? What else has been lost in the turning of the map? This is the philosophical core of our journey. It is not just about trade goods or ancient roots, it's about perception. How we see Africa, how we place it in time and space, and how we let its truths inform our own. Because when we stop seeing Africa as a place that history happened to, and start seeing it as a place that made history, the world itself begins to look different. The center shifts, the narrative rebalances, and the truth comes into view, not as a distant echo, but as a living pulse, still beating at the heart of the world. Before colonial borders, before broken maps, before the silence imposed by conquest and rewritten timelines, Africa moved. It thrived. It spoke through rivers, winds, and stars, from the sands of the Sahara to the ports of the Indian Ocean. From the Red Sea crossings to the Atlantic currents, Africa was never a footnote. It was the heartbeat of a world that was already global long before globalization had a name. We've retraced ancient routes carved not by empires, but by memory. trade networks that ran deep beneath the desert, across open seas and through sacred cities. The Sahara connected scholars and merchants. The Nile and Red Sea carried kings and goods to Arabia and beyond. The Swahili Coast danced with monsoons and foreign sails. African voices echoed in India. Whispers of ancestry lived on in the Sidis, and African knowledge pulsed through the gold-hungry veins of Rome. Even the Atlantic, with its controversial yet compelling clues, suggests a story still unfolding, one of daring navigators, drifting seeds, and lost contact waiting to be remembered. This wasn't isolation. It was integration. This wasn't reaction. It was initiation. Africa did not wait for the world to arrive. It built the world's early systems of movement, thought, and exchange. And when we speak of a pre-colonial world system, we speak of something real, complex, rhythmic, and centered on the continent that too often has been left at the edge of the page. The challenge now is not just to know this, but to feel it, to carry it forward, and to speak it loudly. Because the world we were taught to see is incomplete. But the world that was, that still pulses beneath our feet, is waiting to be redrawn. So if this journey moved you, don't let it end here. Like this video to honor the forgotten navigators, the kings, queens, scholars, and sailors who mapped the unseen world. Subscribe to this channel for more truths hidden in plain sight, more stories waiting to rise from the dust. Comment below. Which ancient African connection surprised you most? Share this documentary, not just to inform, but to awaken, to redraw the map of memory together, because the world changed, but the truth never disappeared. It was just waiting for us to return.